Good morning. This is Chewing the Gristle, a poetry chat with Al Black and Tim Conroy, as well as our guest today will be Libby Bernardin. Libby Bernardin is a South Carolina poet whose chapbook, The Book of Myth, in 2009 was one of 6 winners of the South Carolina Poetry Initiative's chapbook contest. Her poems have appeared in numerous journals, and her full-length collection, Fierce with Triumph and Self-Revelation, was called Stones Ripe for Sowing and was published in 2018 by Press 53. Her poem Name Day won honorable mention in the Porter Fleming contest in 1990 and was included in a novel, The Stealing, with McGraw-Hill in 1993. In 1986, she was South Carolina Arts Commission's Literary Fellow. Her poem Transmigration was nominated as a 2017 Pushcart Prize. Once she even studied at the Haydn Dream Institute in Charlotte, North Carolina, and this learning about dreams and symbols and mythology has informed her work. She is retired from the University of South Carolina and is a lifetime member of the Board of Governors for the South Carolina Academy of Authors. Welcome, Libby.
Thank you, Al. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. It's so good to be here with you and Tim, and I'm looking forward to our time together.
Were you always interested in poetry? Has it been a lifelong thing, or has it come on more at a later time in your life? And who were your influences early on and now?
Well, yes, I've always been interested in poetry. When I was 5 or 6 years old, my father came home from work at the paper mill, and he had an armload of books, and he had saved these books from the mill vat. You know, they had this pulp that they go through and make, and they put all the paper stuff in. Anyway, he came in with this whole armload of books, and he said, "These are for you, sister," which is what my family called me. And in it was Alice in Wonderland and a big red book of poetry. And I don't remember what happened to the poetry book. I still have my Alice in Wonderland. But that stirred me so much, those poems that I read. I'm pretty sure I remember Robert Louis Stevenson, but I'm not real sure of all the people who might have been in it. And I think that because my mother and her family were, well, one was a classical singer, but they all could sing and they all could play the piano. And I was very accustomed to gathering around the piano with my mother and her sisters. And I think music, hearing them speak. My grandfather was a preacher, and hearing him preach, such a lyrical way of speaking when he preached, that I just became more and more interested as I grew up. Now, I never really began to write poetry until much later in life. Well, that's not quite true. I wrote poems, but I didn't think anything about these were poems anybody else would ever want to see. But in my 30s, I began to be more serious, and one of the first people I took a workshop from was Louis Rubin. I had no idea who he was. The old Columbia Museum of Art had invited him, and a friend with whom I shared my work, did encourage me. He said, "You need to take this workshop." And I was absolutely terrified, but I went to the workshop, and I don't know that anything real significant happened, except there was this sense of belonging to these people around the table, that there was something about being with them they were all sharing their work, and they were much better than I at that time. But I felt like, oh my, I'm part of a tribe. I'm part of a group. How exciting. Although Louis Rubin did he didn't exactly bomb my poems, but he said, so much baby talk. I was trying to write like E. E. Cummings, I think. But that was kind of the start of really getting very serious about it. And from then on, it was really some time before I went to college. I never did go to college. And I was probably in my mid-30s by then, and my husband said, I don't know why you don't, we're right here in Columbia, why aren't you going to college? Get a degree. You go to the library, you read all these books, and see, why don't you do it? You like to write. And reluctantly, I did go, and I said, okay, if I make a C, I'm going to take English and psychology. And if I make a C, I'll go back. Well, I surprised myself. I did pretty well and began a college career, so to speak, because it took me about 4.5 years to get through, because I would go in the summer too. And I was lucky enough to get, for my instructor for English 102, Paula Goff. Do you all know who she is? I know y'all are so young, you might not. But
You don't
Paula
approve
Goff,
the name, but I don't know her.
well, she was the James Dickey's assistant. And she insisted that I take his class. And I was not ready to take James Dickey's class. But that really, he was amazing. He was not there sometimes, but when he was probably the most learned person I had been in contact with regularly about poetry. And I really did learn a lot taking that class, although I wouldn't give much. I've come across those poems. They're pretty awful. But in 1989, I was watching PBS the night after. That's why I remember this. Hugo had hit in 89 in September 27th or something like that. And the next night I was watching PBS and Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers used to have a series about poetry and had wonderful people, Lee Young Lee, Joy Harjo, and many others, numerous others. At the night I was watching him, he interviewed Joy Harjo. And I was just blown away. I thought, oh my God, I didn't know anybody could write that beautifully. I had, of course, I've read Shakespeare, and I love Shakespeare, and I still go back to him. But there was something that spoke to me when she read her poems and talked about her ancestors, that her ancestors came to her. She's talked a lot about that. And I always had this sense of this voice, I was hearing this voice when I wrote poetry. And that, plus the fact that my grandmother was part Choctaw, and I wanted to write about that. And then the whole cultural appropriation was becoming really important about that time. Well, it was always, but more in poetry talk. And so I just said, I've got to go out. I got to hear her. I've got to go to wherever she's going to be. And not long after that, she was at the Aspen Writers Conference that they used to have. I think it was 1990, 91, something like that. And I didn't like to travel by myself, but I just signed up for that 2-week workshop. And Kurt Brown was running the workshop at that time, or the conference at that time. And I just sent off my poems, and I said, oh, well, forget that. And, of course, I got accepted, like, I guess, sort of like being, anyway, I'll just say I got accepted. I'll leave it at that. And it was marvelous. It was one of the most meaningful things. And maybe at the end of the show, I'll read the poem that is very significant for me that came from that workshop. Or I can read it now whenever you would like me to do that. But those are kind of the first steps that move me toward getting more and more serious about my work and beginning to share it more. I wrote, but I didn't send to journals. I never did that. But then I began to be more active with trying to get my poetry out a little bit.
Libby, you know, this, I revisited your collection, and I think it's just fabulous. Every time I go to this book, I learn more and more. And your observations of the natural world, your use of diction, your poetic elements are just beautiful. I want to ask you, you know, when you start out writing poetry and you're not writing as good as these poems are, what advice can you give to the emerging writer about working through frustration, mediocrity, to get to this point where you can craft such poems?
Well, thank you for that, Tim. I appreciate it. For me, it was just, in one way, following this instinct, like I've got to go to Aspen, Colorado and hear Joy Harjo. Putting yourself out there. But the other thing is just know that you're not going to be an immediate, you know, accomplished poet. So you've got to keep writing. You've got to read. I started reading poets that I didn't know anything about when, like Linda Paston, for example. This was about that time she was writing a lot. I was reading major poets, and I think young poets should do that. You should go back and read Shakespeare. I still like William Butler Yeats, and I read a lot of his work from time to time. But Elizabeth Bishop is another poet I like a lot. But start looking at what is coming out, what are the new emerging writers. I love today's writers. There's so much to read from writers and poets that maybe aren't all that famous, but I mean, I so much appreciate what you just said about my work, and it's just nice to have work that by people who maybe aren't so well known, but there's something in the poetry that you like. Reading and constantly working on your own work. Don't write it and think, oh boy, this is great, because it's probably not going to be. Just have to learn how to edit, share your work. Years ago, I worked with the Deadline Club in Columbia. Curtis Derrick, you guys know, he was a member, and we all worked together real hard. And one of the best things I think I did was to join, always be involved with a writing group. Right now I'm working with 3 women from Columbia. And yesterday, I had a Zoom meeting with 9 poets from Charleston. And if you don't do things like that, you're going to be insular. And you may be writing some pretty good stuff, but mostly I suspect you're going to need to be out a little bit more. Take a risk. Find somebody you like who might work with you. Share your work with others, friends, anybody that you think is a good poet. Don't share it with the person you love if they don't like poetry. I would use caution there. Yeah, so reading and sharing your work and writing and editing your own work.
So, Libby, what makes a good poem? What is a good poem to you?
Say that again, Tim.
What makes a good poem? What distinguishes good poetry?
Well, there are a lot of different ideas about that, I'm sure, but for me, the craft in a poem is important. And that's one of the things I've developed. I've got a pretty good ear for that I've developed over the years. I've got this wonderful poem by Major Jackson that he just, oh, it's just marvelous. I thought I had it here. I won't read it, but just some of the things that he does in here, the way he describes, he wrote it, it's called Spain, and he wrote it for Mark Strand, but the way he describes what is immediately there and how he puts that together. And I don't think you can do that if you don't read other people's work, and if you don't read, like I'm reading Robert Haas right now on form. And it's not that he's saying anything real new about poetry and the form in poetry, but it's just making me think about form. Another question I ask myself about some poems that are very popular today and some writers, I'll be honest with you, I don't get anything out of their work. And it's real hard for me to stay with them. So I feel like for me, I've got to have the poem in some kind of form. Maybe it's just being an old girl. I like to have something there that's kind of like a little cup, and it's got all this wonderful coffee in it or something, and I can sip it and appreciate it. I don't like it scattered all over the page. It's not good for me anyhow.
Well, how about reading us a couple of your poems?
Sure.
To that. And then afterwards, Al will ask a couple more questions. We'll
Okay.
chat.
Well, I'm going to read the latest poem that I've had published in the journal Plain Songs. It's called Plain Songs. And I'll just read it. Sun-splashed ryegrass, near rose perfume in the garden. I wish to catch it before I light the fire under the crisp-leaved collards and the cold water-filled kettle. The taste of frying shrimp on the long-ago river where Uncle fried catfish and hush puppies. When the Winnebago pulled up with my cousin stepping out in her blue blouse and tight black pants, wearing our days together with all the stories, the gone-away wisdom people now filling our arms as we race toward one another, ready to give them life. The farm, the mule, the Althea tree, that life, backlit and obsolete, full of contradiction, what we chose to remember. One of the things I've been thinking about in writing today is not just memory, but how memory is, there are different levels of memory. And when my brother was alive and I'd tell him about something, he'd say, oh, no, it wasn't that. So-and-so wasn't there, that kind of thing. So I was thinking about that in writing this poem and how much the past means to us when we write and as we grow older. But I don't want it to be nostalgic. I want it to be something that others might enjoy. And I think this poem does reflect on the past, but with maybe a dash of thinking about memory and what it's like. So I'll read from my Stones Right for Sewing. And I had a little thing in here that I've lost. So why don't I read the poem I wrote for Joy Harjo and my grandmother, who was part Choctaw. And this has changed in form a little bit, but it's the one that, Al, that you mentioned earlier. It is the one that won an honorable mention. David Bottoms chose it during that, I've forgotten which group, the Porter Fleming. It was in the Porter Fleming contest. She who listens to hummingbirds. This guttural breath of thunder commanded me to find her here, feet planted in snow far from home, hands beckoning from her curtain of raven hair, face smooth as river pearls, her skirt purple hyacinth. We sit and watch whatever these shivery trees are as her hair turns silver. Then on my knees, right hand trembling with one wild stream of hair, my left gathering another, I braid to her waist. Spirit, let wind stir, though it empties my hands of her, as I stand bereft on Cemetery Lane and ox-eyed daisies and columbine, as thunder rumbles in the mountains. She names me. Words fall like rain, slips among leaves, adds to streams, catches on wings, just beginning to feather. Thank you. My grandmother had very long hair, and she taught me how to braid. So it was kind of a homage to her and to Joy for helping me find my voice in writing about those things that were true of me, of whatever little drop of Native American heritage I have. Do you want another one, or do you want to ask some questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Of course, Tim and I, we have a lot of questions, and we're going to ask a few of them. My next question for you, and by the way, I'm a big Joy Harjo fan. My father was raised by his half Native American, half Irish grandmother for the early part of his life. So there's an affinity there.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but yeah, Joy Harjo is a gift.
To you. Yeah.
Yeah, she is a gift, and we're so fortunate that she's doing a second year as poet laureate.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you reading now? And in your reading and in your writing, how much revision takes place? And when do you know, as you read and look at other folks, and then it informs your writing, when do you know your poem is done?
Well, to that last question, I'm not sure I ever do know, and I've heard other people, other poets say that. I get a sense, and maybe at the end of the session, I'll read the latest poem I've written, and I have a sense that that is ready. I've got a couple of phrases I want to work on a little bit, and when I get that feeling, well, maybe I can send it out, I will. And I consider it ready to that point. But the ladies I'm working with in Columbia, and you guys know them, Betsy Thorne, Susan Craig, and Ann Humphreys, they have read the poem, and we kind of went back and forth on it because I wasn't sure what I was saying in the poem. Have you ever had that experience? You just have to keep going with it till you say, oh, that's what I meant. So anyway, I always like to have at least one person read before I send anything out. But one thing, I'm a bad, I leave off commas because I don't like commas, but sometimes I have to use the commas, so that sort of thing. Right now I'm reading Come the Slumberous to the Land of Nod by Tracy Brimhall. Tracy is a young poet. She's won numerous awards in her poetry. And during the writing of this book, she was, I think, she and her husband were going through a divorce. Her mother had died, and she had had a baby, and, all these major life events had occurred to her. And I find the book very powerful. I could never write like Tracy. And that's something that I like to do, is to read poems. I could never write like Major Jackson, but I want to see what other people like these two young people are doing. And it gives me courage to try some things that I might not try. But and there's one other person. Oh, LaRon Bosselar. Do y'all know who she is? She actually was Kurt Brown's wife back in the day before he passed away, doing the Aspen Conference. And that's how I met both of them and Joy. And so this past January, I went to the Palm Beach Poetry Festival. I think it was my third or fourth year. And Joy was there. I had a chance to talk with her, and she said, "Oh, you used to be in my class or my workshop," and it just thrilled me to death that she would remember. But kind of lost where I was going with this. But LaRon, with a person with whom I'm about to start working again, was one of I was in her workshop. And so they are the ones I'm reading right now. Oh, and I'm going back to Jack Gilbert a little bit. I like his work. These are all poets that write very differently from the way I write, but I think I learned from them, and I hope young poets are realizing that they very much need to do that as they move forward.
Libby, in your
Did I get everything? Okay.
I think you did. That was a great answer. The poems that you write, do some of them require research? Are you a researcher for your poems, or are you using more interior material for your poems to come out, or both?
Well, I would say more interior, but lucky me, I am a partner to a wildlife biologist. So he's my research go-to person. I can, because most of my images are from nature, and they've always been that way, but I can go to Phil and say, I think this is a so-and-so tree, but I'm not real sure. And the poem I'm going to read at the end of our session has my grandfather rolling cigarettes. You know, I put Lucky Strikes, and Phil didn't think that was accurate, and we talked about that. And so I dropped out Lucky Strike because Phil was saying probably at that time, Lucky Strike, it was some other tobacco company, and I didn't think it sounded good enough to keep. And it didn't matter. I just used tobacco and let it go at that. But I do have to look up things. Sometimes I have not so much as I used to. I have biblical references, and I would have to look up, like in that book you mentioned, Tim, I've got that very first poem is about Queen Esther. And I had to go back in the Old Testament and look up who she was. And I don't say much about her, but what I say I feel like is true to what I read. So I do some research, but almost always the poem starts within. Or sometimes something I've read from a poem. I might, like one of the poems that I have in that book is, I took a line from Katie Ford's, one of her poems. So I do a little research, but it's mostly interior to begin with.
You know, I guess my follow-up question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Al, is, you know, you seem to use so wisely an expansive vocabulary. Your diction is incredible in these poems, and they enrich your poems so much. What other poetic elements do you tend to use and go to help your poems sing and move to the listener?
Well, as much as I can in a natural way. I think metaphor is great. It really makes a poem move and adds depth to it. When the metaphor occurs naturally, like the notion of my grandmother braiding her hair when I wrote that poem, it's better. I have stretched for metaphor and I just get rid of it. It doesn't work for me. So I think that it's real important for the poem to have something that a person might see as a comparison if a reader would understand. I do sometimes include that. But I say my poems aloud. In fact, I've started recording them, you know, that little thing on your phone. And when I hear some things, I just cringe. And when I hear others, I think, yeah, I believe that's the way I want it. So sound is real important, though sometimes I think I don't use sound imagery enough in my poems. But so the image, metaphor, and how the syntax, you know, I think it's much more important than I used to give credence to. Syntax needs to, you got to think about the reader. And is the reader going to be able to follow what you're saying in your poem? And that might be one reason I have trouble, as I mentioned earlier, with poems who jump too much. I like a jump. I really do. That there's a big switch from what in the poem to something else. But when it's switch after switch after switch, I tend to get a little confused. So, yeah, I would add syntax to that list, too.
And that's a great answer. Thank you, Libby. Brother Al.
Before we get to your recitation of that recent poem, I'm wondering about your life experience and the projects and your life experience and faith, your beliefs, and the projects you are working on now. How are they intersecting in what you're writing?
Mm-hmm. Well, life experience, I think memory is very powerful still to me. And I'm thinking about that as I'm working on a new project. Right after we meet here, I'm to call Laurent Basilar, and we're going to set up working together with some of my new poems. And I am now, I have about 36, something like that. So I'm thinking I might be moving toward some focus that might make a manuscript. I'm not sure of that yet, but that's kind of my purpose in writing and getting help from Laurent. But the poems that I think my life, maybe I should say this, I think my life experience has been, and it's one of the things I worry about in writing, is that I haven't had a lot of horrible things happen to me. I was from a working class family. My father loved me, helped take care of me. My mother loved me. And while we had our issues, I just never had trauma where my parents were concerned. And the greatest thing that occurred in the way of trauma was the death of my husband. And I think even today that shapes my thinking. So if it comes together, I'm not sure I just think it's coming together. It just does. You know, those things happen as you write.
Well, Libby, can you tell us or tell the listeners how they can get a copy of Stones Ripe for Sowing?
Yes, Stones Ripe for Sowing was published by Press 53, which is in Winston-Salem. And you can go online to press53.com and order the book. And I have some copies. I don't usually like to have to fool with it, but if anybody can talk to you guys and get I prefer not to give out my email like right now. I don't know why would that matter? But I do have some copies too here.
Well, how about send us out with some poetry?
All right. This is the poem I mentioned earlier, and it's my new poem. About yesterday. It's always behind us, holding on to what needs to go. My husband's death, your divorce, those days left us brooding under a dappled, bluesy sky. Today, you and I, alive with the sun's glint on the loquat tree, breakfast on the porch, frittata of eggs, mushroom, and onion, served with avocado and biscuit. We watch the young flicker feed, furtive, wary. We take solace in our past. For me, the farm, grandfather and grandmother in their kitchen. He rolls his cigarette, watches her hands in biscuit dough, their yesterday in growing crops, feeding field hands. You at play on the river, fishing, your stories of Daddy Ben and how he taught you hunting ethics. Kill only what you will eat, waste nothing of your catch. Be a good master to the pup I give you. So about yesterday, it's behind us. Dreamy flits of memory, lost loves we can't catch, grief rendered, useless, the choices we made. But look here, this poem I made for you on the desk you made for me.
That's fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful. I'm so glad to talk with y'all.
Well, we're very happy to have you because in many ways with Litchfield Tea, you have been a host for South Carolina and for many people in the Southeast. And it's an honor to have you as a poet on our Chewing the Gristle. And we want to thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been my pleasure and delight. I've enjoyed it so much. And Tea and Poetry will get started up again this year, so stay tuned, or the 2021 rather. So stay tuned.